Hello, I am Kevin Anderson.
And I'm Adam Okada.
And we are clinical educators and hosts of the Ask the Educator podcast, brought to you by Healthmark, a Getting a company.
Are you a sterile processing technician, infection preventionist, or biomedical engineer? No matter your role, if you're involved in medical device processing, this podcast is for you. Our goal is to equip you with the knowledge and tools for excellence in medical device processing.
Now let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ask the Educator podcast. This is Kevin Anderson, your host as well. Joining me, I have Adam Okada as always. And for this episode, we have with us Garland-Rhea Grisby from Kaiser Permanente. He's an interim assistant director of sterile processing as well as endoscope service manager. Garland just wrapped up an international webinar with our team talking about TIR99. So for those of you who are not familiar with that document, it is from AAMI. It is something that has to deal with dilators, ultrasound probes, and all of that in healthcare facilities. So Garland, welcome to the show, man. I know we've talked about doing this for a long time, and so I'm happy to have you finally on the show. So just to get it kick-started here, why don't you just explain a little bit about the role that you play in the working group for flexible endoscopes and how the TIR document for probes and dilators came about?
I actually just concluded my second term as co-chair for Working Group 84. It has been amazing and a learning experience, to say the least. Starting off as a voting member and then going into being a co-chair was amazing. But my role is to basically mediate and make sure that everybody's voice is heard, and to make sure everybody has an opportunity to bring in their expertise. And this is how these documents come about. And as far as the TIR, once we finished the second go round or the second edition of ST91, that was the question. Presentations were given about ST91 and the updates, and a slew of questions just started coming in. Well, what about ultrasound probes? What about TEEs? And what about this? And it was like, okay, we got to do something about this. And then because there's confusion out there. There's so many different platforms. And again, IFUs are they're not in harmony with each other. And then in some facilities, even the facility that I work with, there was 7 different probe manufacturers, 3 different TEE manufacturers. So it was hard. And so this TIR was warranted and on time.
Yeah, it absolutely was. And I know at my facility, when we were doing high-level disinfection, we also had probes and dilators, but we were just trying to follow ST91. But there's so many differences between a flexible scope and a probe and a dilator in the usage, in the areas where it's used, all these kinds of things. So what are the unique challenges when you guys were coming up with the TIR99? What were the unique challenges of creating a document for probes and dilators?
I remember the first meeting. The first meeting we had was a few hours, and it was interesting to say the least, because there was just a ton of information that was coming in because we had vendors there. We had vendors there from probe manufacturers, and they gave their input, and they gave us a different aspect that we didn't think about, right? Some things that we didn't think about was like the intended use and things like gel and stuff like that, because we're just, the process. So we had to kind of pause and step back and breathe, and then let everybody speak their piece, from the user, from the vendor, and then just as a whole, just everybody spoke their piece. And the document was massive at first. And I was like, this is not a TIR.
I remember that, yeah.
It's not a TIR. And then so we just broke it down, and here we are, 2 years later?
Yeah, I'd say the fact that this thing is, out 2 years later is rather impressive. You mentioned some of the things that resonated with me about this, thinking about my OR days and stuff, and the way that these ultrasound probes kind of started making their way into the OR more and more, and even in the pre-op area with the anesthesia. And then you had like sometimes patients would come in that were pregnant to the OR area, but then they would need OBGYN to come down and do a, an ultrasound on them and all of this kind of thing. And so these devices, to your point, man, they're coming from all over. They're used by people from all different departments. And then one of the things that stuck out to me when it was first introduced in the OR to me was the surgeon who brought it in was a cardiovascular guy. And he's like, listen, all you got to do is make sure you don't break this probe. And all you do is you wipe it off. You just wipe off the gel with a 4x4, and that's it. That's it. Otherwise, you're gonna damage it. So, and I knew there was something wrong with that, right? But unfortunately, at the time, I was very ignorant to the IFUs and all of this stuff. But this, to your point about it being timely, it is definitely timely. So, something else that kind of resonated with me and kind of leads into the next question here is how these babies are used, man. Sometimes I see, you take a probe and like doc's got like one hand is using the probe in a sort of non-sterile fashion while their right hand is still sterile and trying to, thread this needle into a femoral artery and all this or whatever. So with that being said, why don't we kind of explain a little bit about the Spalding classification scale and how it applies to probes and dilators in TIR99? Because obviously there's some gray areas there, it seems like, right?
Right there, your experience was exactly why. That's exactly why.
Yep.
And I'm not sure if you remember, but when we were talking about it, I think the bulk of the issue was these percutaneous procedures. And it was, well, there's this and there's that, and this touches the patient, but that doesn't touch the patient. And then that's why we called out, okay, what is the distance from the probe to the patient? And because ultimately it was like, well, all surface probes have to be high level disinfected. And that discussion lasted for months. And we put it in the document like, okay, this is it. And everybody was up in arms in every facility. I remember everybody in my facility, there was a national meeting and everybody was mad. And the physicians were like, we don't have enough probes to send them down to get processed. And then just before we went to our final review for TIR99, there was more research that came about. And it was like, here's a new study. This doesn't have to apply. And here's this clause, right? And we call it out in there as far as percutaneous procedures are concerned. We have the charts that just made it so much easier. But even with the charts and trying to come up with how we define the Spalding classification and apply it to probes, that took, I believe, about 3 subcommittees. And then we agreed. And then it took another subcommittee. And then it got to the point where it was like, listen, can we live with this? And it was like, yes, we can live with this, because you get to the point where, honestly, the more you look at things, the more things you find, right? It's kind of like if you sit there and look at your sink in your decontam room, you will begin to see things that you didn't see yesterday because you just keep looking at it. You're like, hey, there's mineral deposits there. So we had to realize, listen, we got to get this document out. We can't wait another year. We can live with it. These folks need to know what they need to do to drive the change in their facilities.
Yeah, and that's the whole purpose of the TIR. I mean, when you're creating a document, any kind of document for an AAMI standard or whatever, the TIR is kind of that first step in possibly going to a standard. So when you're creating those documents, it's really challenging to understand the complexities of a new issue. And with probes and dilators, it was incredibly complex going through that process of, okay, we're in a sterile or a semi-sterile procedure, but then there's the possibility of, opening up a wound, and now you're in a sterile procedure. So now you have to sterilize, but these things can't be sterilized. So it was a very complex. I remember going back and forth on that. And you're right, like just the complexity of changing from the flexible scope document and then turning it into probes and dilators was just incredibly. And you and Marianne,
yep,
and I believe now it is Amanda that's doing that document.
Melinda.
Oh, Melinda. Sorry. Yes, you're right. Yes. It's just the kudos to you guys for getting through that, and just incredible work that you guys did on TIR99.
I couldn't have done it without Marianne. Marianne was my saving grace. She'd be like, calm down, it's gonna be okay.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you've been through this before. And she's like, plenty of times.
Yes, we lean on her a lot here too. Trust me. But I had a story from one of my facilities that I went and did an audit at. It was so I came in to do an endoscopy audit, and I was looking at their endoscopy department, gave some recommendations, some suggestions, and then they were like, oh, do you want to see where we do the probes? And I was like, sure, let's go take a look at where the probes are. And of course, there's like 6 different departments that have TEE probes, and they're all over the hospital. We're kind of walking around, and one of the departments had the procedure room, and then right outside the procedure room in a public hallway, they had 3 TEE, I don't know what you call them, the manual soaking tubes that were sitting in the public hallway.
Oh, no.
Because they knew not to do it in the procedure room, but they had it sitting in the hallway, which I guess they thought was better. And I just remember thinking like, okay, so people just have no guidance on this, and that's what that TIR is for. But what are your recommendations for hospitals that just, they never planned for having to process probes? What's your suggestions for them if you have a situation like that?
So we have a group that actually reports up to infection prevention. And it is, some people call it different things in their area. Some people call it EROC. And in my area, I called it EPROC, which was Endoscope and Probe Reprocessing Oversight Committee. And there we had a charter, and we had all of the stakeholders. Who has probes? Who uses probes? Where are they processed? And then we start there. And then generally, getting with the senior leaders that cover a wide range, they have a greater purview to know, okay, well, this department does, they don't. And so that's what we used to, when things come, we just dealt with it. Oh God, last year, I have 3 departments that never used scopes before. Now, all of a sudden, they have scopes. And I'm like, why? Why would we do that? And why wouldn't we give them disposable? And so it's having that relationship with those higher ups, and definitely infection prevention, because they know what's coming in. And also the buy to pay, or your folks, your materials and your ClinTech or biomed folks that have to keep track of inventory of things like that, because they will let you know, or they should let you know, hey, this is what's coming in. It's unfortunate sometimes because we've had to turn some folks away. Like, well, you spent $500,000 and we can't process it because we should have had the conversation first. We don't have the proper chemicals, and we're not going to do it. Sorry, and then it's like, oh, well, we can't get a refund. It's like, well, we can't process off label either. So that's the struggle. So it's having a committee, and all of these folks need to be involved so that everybody know, hey, look, if you have an idea, if you're planning on trialing anything, Kevin, you talked about the OR and probes popping up. Well, I just got an email 2 weeks ago. Yeah, we're going to be doing a trial. And I was like, okay, send me the IFU. And then I saw the IFU and I was like, I've never seen an IFU like this before. This is a probe. I was like, why? But, and I expressed my concerns, and they're like, okay, we'll get with our R&D folks and we'll get back to you. But again, things are popping up, but just having that relationship where folks will know, and having a person, a content expert that they can reach out to, say, hey, look, we have a probe coming in. Well, talk to Kevin, talk to Adam, talk to Garland. So just them knowing who to talk to.
Yeah, I think those are some great points, having that multidisciplinary team, and then having that executive sponsorship that you're talking about. I mean, those guys who are, up the chain a bit and then can approve or for funds and things like that, and getting infection prevention involved is really critical, because they really help in terms of educating the whole, the whole hospital leadership. And then obviously for those of us in the sterile processing world or high-level disinfection world, having a seat at the table so we can explain those things to them, so we can explain the needs and all of that. And I think one of the things that sometimes is a miss is we touched on it a little bit, but when they're in these other departments where people are generally not from sterile processing or from endo, historically. And then that's when they end up kind of getting into trouble, as they start doing it without someone like the subject matter expert around, and they just figure it out and make stuff up. And then, then we get pulled in later. So hopefully there's a process in place, as you said. But before we wrap up, I do want to mention, remember, like I mentioned at the beginning, this is part of an international webinar that Garland, you just did for us. So I wanted to point people in the direction of that if they want further detail on this. And of course, they can reach out with questions or anything like that. But before we wrap up, any final thoughts that you might have for people who are not maybe aware of TIR99, or maybe where to get it or how to apply it, or any of that stuff? What do you think might be the last thing that you'd want to share with our listeners about this?
I would say do not hesitate on purchasing this TIR. It will be definitely beneficial for you and your facility, especially with all of the different changes that are going on today. It'll give you a baseline of what you should do and in your facility, regardless of the setting, whether it's clinical or non-clinical. And you can drive whatever change you need to, because it's there in writing. There was a ton of content experts there. There was a ton of microbiologists there, physicians, you name it. Everybody was involved in this document. And so this will definitely be beneficial for your facility, regardless of the setting.
The TIRs tend to end up becoming standard. So might be a good idea to get on top of that now, right? And so anyway, Garland, thanks for joining us on the show. I really appreciate it. For those of you out there listening, check out the international webinars, check out the YouTube education page. We appreciate your listening, and we hope these podcasts really help you out. So thank you. All opinions expressed on this episode are those of the presenters. This podcast is for informational purposes only.
Before using any medical device, it's important to review the manufacturer's instructions for use and consult with a professional.
For any questions or feedback, please reach out to us at asktheeducator@hmark.com.